Thank you for having me. I think it's, to your point, there's been some really interesting research coming out. I think also on this call because we have a cross of different regions, I think we're going to be hearing some really interesting things today. So I think for me, some of the challenges are just exciting things I see coming through. One of the exciting things I've seen in our region is really the maturity journey that we have been on. So I think a couple of years ago, it was mostly on clicks, impressions, just the quick stuff, right, that you could get or gather. I've been really seeing a focus on audience-centric measurement and research, meaning instead of just talking about a single performance KPI, we're more talking about what is the audience impact. I said this the other day on a panel, if your goal doesn't in some way involve some sort of behavior change, then it's not a good enough goal, right? And if you need to attribute that to an audience. So being able to look at the full audience ecosystem, meaning what touch points do they have that are going to be important for what you're trying to share? Who do they trust? What influences them? Really helps you to build out a stronger research, measurement, and evaluations program. It also brings much more interesting insights to help a campaign at the very beginning. So I've been very excited in the region to see that maturity. I'm hearing more people speak about putting that audience at the center. And even if we still don't have all the data we wished, it gets us asking smarter questions and putting that forward. When it comes to challenges, I still see us being very, very tactic focused, meaning I run multiple boot camps, I help a lot of clients, and I always think the hardest part is going to be filling out what we do when we get to filling out the actual data points that we want to use in the KPI framework. The actual hard part is getting people to get their business goals and their communications objectives, because they want to jump straight into, I'm going to run the same campaign like we did last year, or I want to put out X number of releases, or I'm going to create X types of content. I'm going to invite X number of influencers in. So they jump straight into that and just think about that data. We really need, as an industry, to be taking a step back and think, do we actually have the goals we need to set ourselves up for success? So it isn't just, I want, X more impressions than the previous year. That doesn't get to a behavior change or what you're trying to do. You need to think about, what is that business goal? So if you had, a couple minutes with the CEO and they were to tell you what their goal is for the year, then how does communications support that and make sure you have a who, what, where, when, by how much, in that goal? It sets you up more for success. And I've seen still far too many reports or examples that when I asked why they were using those numbers, no one could really answer for me. And it caused me to ask, so what, so many times, that there is actually not a huge benefit to the report that I was seeing. And then finally, some exciting innovations. So I think we've all been hearing about attribution for a long time in our industry, and kind of always struggling with it. And I think we've been seeing some really exciting things come through in the attribution world. Carlos and I actually had a whole conversation about this the other day. I think obviously there's still a long way for us to go. Some technology still needs to get better. There's also, data privacy and access issues in certain regions. But, for example, at Ketchum, we've created a tech stack where, we are able to say, of the people exposed to certain content, so we don't need to wait for a pixel or anything like that, of the people exposed, did they then either go make a purchase? We could survey them directly to see if a behavior change was there. So we're actually able to say, of the people exposed to certain content, they brought X new entrants into a purchase field, or they actually made certain purchases. And we haven't had that before. And it's still something that we're working on for certain regional data. And I know there's a lot of our technology partners who are right there with us, and really interesting things that they're doing. So I think in the past, when I would hear attribution, I kind of rolled my eyes. I think what we're seeing over the past year, and kind of as we go into the future, there's some really exciting things to keep an eye on, as well as what do some future data privacy issues and laws, how may that impact it? But I'd say from a North America standpoint, those are some of my points that I think are interesting. It's moving towards more audience centric, the challenge of still being very tactic focused and needing to put more focus on your business goals and objectives. And attribution, I think, is something that we're finally really getting to. And I'm excited to see what technology can continue to bring us.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think so looking ahead around audience centric focus, and we'll definitely touch on that after we hear from Gareth and from Carlos. Gareth, perhaps I'll start with you next. If you want to give your own snapshot from your point of view.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks for joining, everyone. Yeah, in terms of trends and opportunities and changes in the marketplace, I think in my career, I've worked in the US for a number of years and spent a lot of time in Europe as well. So it's always interesting to see the different approaches and the similarities in opportunities and challenges. I think the US has always been a driver of innovation in the measurement marketplaces. And initially from being an early adopter of measurement, when measurement and monitoring was a very laborious process, I think US organizations led the charge into technology, using databases, software approaches and platforms for monitoring and measurement. So that early adoption of technology is also leading to an early out. And by that, I mean, I think there has been a very much of an emphasis on technology in the marketplace and a bit of a perpetuation of a myth by technology vendors and just people who want to succeed and succeed quickly, that technology provides insight, and where technology provides data, it provides structure, it provides access to content. But what I'm seeing in the US market and in Europe, especially with larger organizations, is that maturity where a hybrid model is starting to come into play. So we're seeing that application of technology where it makes sense on big data sets, on social media data, for example, but also the real need, especially at a board level, to go the extra mile and turn that into insights, not what went up, what went down, but why is the situation as it is? What can be done to change it? What are the impacts in there, etc. So I think that adoption of technology, that perpetuation of that myth, and also to some extent, and coming from a social media background, maybe I'm guilty of it, there's also been an overemphasis on AI. And I'm a massive proponent for AI when it's used and used well in the right kind of applications. But the technology market has somewhat sold a dream of where AI is right now, and it doesn't always deliver on that. I'm happy to talk about that in a moment. So what we're seeing is first into technology, not first out of technology, but really that pickup of the hybrid approach, bringing consultancy back into play, bringing real business insights rather than just measurement for measurement's sake. Secondly, what I'm seeing in the market, and again, this is partly to do with access to data, is more social integration. By that, I mean social data content, social metrics, and I think that's a reflection of consumers. Consumers don't divide the media landscape up into nice, neat chunks of radio, broadcast, online. They get their information from a variety of sources, and often when questioned, don't remember where they got that information. So we're seeing a lot of blurring of the lines, and because of that, the need to integrate traditional editorial news content creator platforms, social media platforms, blogs, forums, etc. And the introduction of social, I think, rather than just as an extra data set, it's really enabling a more 360 approach to brand reputation. So right from strategy to planning, implementation, to the specific tactics and the measurement. So social data is used to research and understand the topics of interest to an audience before going ahead with the campaign. Why reinvent the wheel when you can find out what the unmet questions of an audience are and produce content to meet them, or understand which content performs well in terms of engagement, for example, and leverage that. You can also understand where there are content gaps. And then when it comes to measurement, it's not just about measuring the amount of content, but also you can look at things like if not only the media are picking up your messaging, your brand pillars, but if your consumers are reflecting that image of your organization back to you. So again, getting towards what Nicole was saying about outtakes and outcomes. It's not about the content that's out there. It's about what impact that has and what it's doing for your business. So social integration, I think, is really useful. And I'll just make one third point. When I joined the industry in 2000, and I'm from CARMA International, which started in the 80s. So, one of the early trends there was the invention of the PDF, for example. What I'm seeing is a real move in my industry, from media measurement to communications measurement in the round. So AMEC and the PRCA have done a lot to drive education in this area. I think we've got a long way to go, but we're seeing right across the industry much more of a focus on that. And as a result, less of a focus on output. Output's never going to go away. It's clearly an important part of the puzzle. But when we are looking at media output and communications output, there's a bigger focus on quality and impact. And one of the things I've seen as a result of that is a lot of requests for impact scoring. So a way of bringing together things like sentiment and quality and reach, rather than just looking at basics like volume and sentiment. If you can get content in high reach, relevant areas where you've got all the right impact measures, that's worth a huge amount of content in low impact media where you're not reaching the right audience. So as a measurement professional, I'm having a lot more conversations about measuring quality and aligning content with corporate objectives, for example, and measuring initiatives way beyond media metrics, bringing in search data, web analytics, and so on and so forth. As a final result of that, I think I'm seeing a lot more interest from heads of marketing in communications data as well. So I think PRs have often been kind of the poor stepchild of marketing when it comes to data, but now we're seeing marketeers realizing that there is good data in the public relations sphere and bringing that in, and PR is getting more of a voice at the table when it comes to data-driven decision making in the organization. So I think for me, they're three of the more interesting trends I'm seeing.
I think your point, especially around AI, is really fascinating, because I think that we all have experience, especially if you've worked in-house, how whenever there's a new piece of technology, there is this real urgent need to just grab at it, use it, and then there's no method or subtlety in the use of it. So it'd be great to definitely explore that shortly. Carlos, I'll pass over to you now if you want to share your own points of view on the state of the industry.
Well, first, let me talk about two very clear challenges that might not be as prevalent in the US or even in Europe, but that are quite a big deal where I'm based. And I would dare to say all across Latin America, and even in some Latin American oriented parts of the US. The first one, and I can't get tired of saying this, but I have to, is we still see a major lack of awareness of proper measurement practices across the region. So that means PR professionals and measurement companies, us included, sometimes are unaware of which are the proper practices, how to properly attribute a change or an outtake or even an outcome to the PR practice. And moreover, many times do not understand or are unaware that there truly exist practices for this. And this is, I would say, this is the region's most important problem right now. It's something that I personally and we as an organization have been battling for the past few years. When I entered this industry, and sorry, Gareth, I haven't been here for 21 years, but I could say I've been for 13 years already in the industry. And I couldn't believe how it was possible that in an industry that should be so paramount to proper management practices and that should provide so much quality information to the CEOs and to the board of directors of large companies. We don't have enough knowledge around the region about what are the practices, how they can sit down with, as Gareth said, with marketing, who are seen as the poster boys for data, and truly prove attribution and derive a value generated by the work of the PR department. So that's more than a trend. I would say that's a reality that we all have to acknowledge and work to surpass. I also feel that there has always been a lack of proper strategic planning in PR, as not only a Latin American problem, but more of a global problem that has been surpassed quite well in the US. And actually do see a trend of what I would call a great leap forward for the region. Some regions, some smaller countries seem to have been way behind and are jumping on the current wave of strategic planning as the way for PR to integrate into modern management. So that is actually quite uplifting. When I hear my commercial team and my salespeople, and even when I do an event such as this one, and I hear people asking, but how can we integrate business objectives into the PR planning? And how can this business, the fact that they're asking it is so uplifting, because it shows that PR is having a very strong and fast professionalization drive around the region. And I think that's quite the trend right now. And it's going to be a very big trend after the pandemic is done, or in the coming years. It's going to be a big trend. As for technology, and what Gareth very well put as first in and last out, or first in, first out for the US regarding AI, I would say in the region, we weren't, and we tend not to be first in or so close to the technology in the US, mainly because the language barrier is so high, and technical developments tend to take a lot more time, especially when related to AI and NLP and voice to text and these types of technologies that tend to be technologies that can integrate and augment the work of any measurement practice 10 or 100-fold. And they can be enormous sources of information that can drive attribution. When you combine those massive sources of information, and you can predict, and you can, use that information and cross it around with survey information and with users' actions and with social media, you can have a very good attribution model, and it can be quite scientific. We are way behind that, but I do feel that there is a yearning for it. I think the conversation between the PR professionals in the US and the local ones is starting to light a spark in, I would say, the minds and the hearts of the local PR professionals. So there is a need. In fact, we see it as a need. We're just a bit behind on the state of the art of the technology. So those would be my three main trends for the region right now.
And thank you very much, Carlos. I'd be interested to know around where the innovation is coming from at the moment across Latin America. Is it coming from the US and the UK as an example? Is there some really good homegrown innovation? Because I think often the answers are, especially across Latin America, there's so many different cultures and also languages, which creates a whole different challenge. Is at the moment, is the innovation coming from within, or is it outside?
Well, historically, innovation in Latin America is government driven. So this is something that, well, technically in the US too, but it's government first and then private industrial, it's the military industrial complex and then the rest of society. Here, it's not so much a military industrial complex, It's just that companies tend to invest very little in R&D. And when I say very little, we're talking maybe 0.3% of the GDP in some countries. Countries with high investment like Brazil, maybe 1% of the GDP, which is way lower than what you would see in the US, Canada, or any developed nation. So governments tend to be drivers of innovation, especially in fields such as AI. Now, the problem with that is that when government drives innovation in that way, it tends to follow, first, government times. Second, it tends to follow government needs. So been a lot of innovation. In fact, innovation in some cases that we've tried to integrate into the measurement side, but it tends to be hard to put, to dismember and get into the measurement side. So for example, while you have very good innovation regarding voice to text in Colombia right now, and regarding NLP in Portuguese in Brazil, and when I say very good, I'm talking state of the art, it's very hard to move that into the needs of the measurement practice. It's hugely hard, and not even speaking about the monitoring practice, which is the one that benefits the most by being able to gather massive amounts of data for the monitoring. So I think a big part of the innovation is adapting what's being done in the US and especially in Europe. Now, what's being done in France and Spain tends to, and sometimes Italy for voice to text and a bit for AI, but especially France for AI and Spain tends to be much more applicable to what we need in Latin America than what you have in the US. The same goes for user experiences. So many times platforms that launch in the US, they're replicated in Latin America to mid to low success, but European platforms tend to launch here and have higher success, especially when those platforms are really dependent on some type of AI or technology that does not exist for the appropriate languages here, and which it's much harder to adapt English to than, for example, Spanish models or French models, because they're both Latin-based languages, and it's much easier to translate, let's say, or to adapt models to them. I think that's where most of the innovation might be coming. I also think that with the current state of AI and the developments in the past 3 to 4 years, there's going to be a big change in that, because more agnostic AIs can be much better deployed in local countries by smaller teams. And that's what's happening right now. Companies such as GlobalNews, which is a mid-tier company in the monitoring business, maybe we're the largest in Latin America, we might be the 3rd largest in the US right now. And when you look at it, or the 4th largest in the US, our budgets are very small, even for R&D department, compared to what Google or Facebook might have. But the changes they're producing right now in AI are actually very transparent and can be very easily applied. So there's a lot of silent technology transfers that I think are forthcoming and that will actually help the region get back into pace. But it won't be homegrown technology, R&D. It will be more adapting R&D that's been done elsewhere to the needs of the local region.
Yeah, and I think off the back of what you just mentioned there, Gareth, I'll just go back to you on the AI on the AI front. What role do you see that playing going forward, and how PR teams really start to embrace that and effectively use it?
Right. I suppose, AI has its challenges. I think it will improve, and I think there's definitely a role for it. Where I see a role for it is kind of just automating some of the things that we need to do to get to a result. Now, AI can do some things at scale that humans can't do, but AI struggles to do some things humans can do very easily, such as apply sentiment to one thing in an article and a different thing in the same article. But I think where it works well is when you've got a lot of data to look at, structuring that data, grouping it into broad topics and things like that. So qualifying data, and I think this is especially important in social. So is it information and content produced by a human or produced by a bot? There's different value in that, and you know, if you're reaching audiences with bot content, it's probably not very impactful. So being able to distinguish, and an AI can do that at a big scale where it just doesn't make sense for a human to comb through that kind of information. Interpreting data, so sentiment, emotion, I think there's a lot of challenges there, but eventually these things will come. I think Carlos is right. They're likely to come in English, Chinese first, other languages are going to follow. Image detection is a great way of interpreting data, and especially as brands are leveraging YouTube influencers and content creators, imagery is ever more important. One thing I've seen it quite well is inferring or completing data. So being able to use a few algorithms to say this content came from this market, for example, where it might not be geolocated. And then some things that analysts do, but that need to be done on scale. So detecting anomalies, for example. And that, again, it's not insight, but if the analyst can jump very quickly to the anomaly, they can form the hypothesis, explore the content, and make a decision. Is this meaningful? Is it truly anomaly, or is this something that's happening in the data that I can use and leverage to tell the client organization this is something that can be acted upon? So it definitely has its role to play, but I think right now it's at the start of the process, and the last mile is always done by analysts, insight professionals, and PRs, because they have the context and they can make recommendations that are relevant into the organization off the back of the data.
And I think one thing just to quickly add there before we go to a different topic is I've seen, and again, Carlos and I were just on a tech panel talking about this, but I think a role that AI can have, good and bad, is bias. So I think in the past, if someone wanted a landscape audit or they wanted a white space analysis, or trying to see what's going on, they would give us, and I want to know what's happening in these topics or these specific silos, not necessarily let's look at the big picture and what topics or silos are naturally popping up, because that can be very difficult for an analyst to go through a ton of data and find that. Where I think we're seeing a lot more of our technology partners having the ability to do some of that AI-based or natural language process-based clustering and bring that forward. Now, you have the same issue, though, that a lot of this AI is still built by humans, and there is some bias in there. So I think it's important for everyone that human analysts may approach something with bias, but the technology may as well. So to Gareth's point of the importance of that analyst being there and questioning the data and thinking through the data, I think is crucial. So it has incredible benefits that it's made, I think, found more insights than I think we might have had in the past, but we need to temper that and then also figure out when is the right place to use AI versus when it is not.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And just sort of off the back of just having all this data together, and how we often say, if you need to show the power of PR, it's really important to bring the numbers to prove its power. But sometimes that's not enough, especially in some boardrooms where they're maybe not particularly that aware of really what PR does. What would your advice be, Nicole, for those who are struggling, in particular for in-house, but also on the agency side, with how do you get people on your side to understand the work that you're doing? Have you seen anything that's effectively that's been good?
Yeah. I think it's also, you don't need to do everything at once. I think people get excited and they have either a ton of data at their fingertips, or they have some new way of approaching it, and they try to present almost too much data to leadership. So you need to take a step and think about storytelling. And I think this ties back to how crucial it is to start with that business goal. So again, you might not be able to get the perfect number, but if you can map a story of data around a business goal that speaks in their language, you can get that story through. And a lot of times you need to tie it to audience, category, and culture. So if you can tell that story of our target audience did XYZ within the category compared to something else, and culturally had relevance or tied here, and how that all maps back to their business goal, we've seen that story. And so I've had some clients very low on the maturity map of their senior leadership understanding why data is important from PR, but they started having some of those conversations and they were able to take a foot to the right and prove the need why they needed to invest in some other type of research, or then a step to the right of why they needed access to data that might have in the past been siloed into different groups internally. So I think sometimes it's really thinking about who's your end audience that you're delivering to, what is the business goal that's in the language that they're speaking, and how can you bring that to life through data that helps tie it to the audience, the category, and culture, helps to bring that to life a bit more in a data narrative, not just numbers that honestly end up on a slide that they throw away because they don't know what the so what is from it.
And for you, Carlos, especially in Argentina, but also across Latin America, have you found that the pandemic has accelerated that, where there is a more of an understanding now between the board, senior management level to the PR, comms teams?
Well, I think we've seen different speeds around the region, accelerated in some cases by the pandemic, that's for sure. I've seen regions, especially in the Andean region, I would say, there has been a major drive towards proving value, especially, well, you always know when costs are cut, it becomes a necessity to both prove value and to demonstrate return. So I have felt that there has been a drive in those regions. And at the same time, other countries that traditionally have been at the forefront, I think have been left behind in the past years. Argentina is one of them. You can see today, I would say the state of PR in Argentina is behind most of the region. And PR is not considered at all. It's not as strategic, and especially it's not measured in a boardroom manner as it should be. I do see that those countries that had higher cost cutting, faster cost cutting, and it has to do more with the economics of those countries. So, for example, you have countries in which cost cutting tends to be a long, drawn out process, such as Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay, due to the law. Countries where you can't fire people legally in Argentina until December this year. Since 2019, it has been illegal to fire people. So literally illegal. So countries where you can't fire people tend to be slower at also adopting innovation in those moments, whilst countries where you had you had the possibility of big change, big transformation, tended to be much faster into saying, well, let's take this as an opportunity and we need to cut costs in PR. Okay, let's cut it. Let's maybe reduce some people, but let's start demonstrating the value of the people that are left. And I think that's where the trend moved. And I think that that's the main thing that made the trend move faster in some regions than some countries than others.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that, Carlos. Gareth, we actually had a question a little bit earlier in the chat, which I might just throw over to you. It's just ask, which platforms would you say are the most popular on a corporate comms level?
In terms of, let me have a look at the question.
Of social content, sorry.
For social content, I think it really depends on the organization. So I think in social, Twitter has been monitored and measured, but for a lot of reasons, one of its popularity, but I've seen that waning. And I've worked over the last few years with a number of fashion organizations. So for fashion organizations, really Twitter is low on the agenda, and sites or platforms like Instagram are really high on the agenda for lots of different reasons, because people express the brand on that platform, and it's a great way of feeding information to the brand as an insights tool. But also we talked a lot about attribution. The path to purchase, for example, is a lot closer on sites like Instagram. Now, if you're in another industry, it wouldn't apply at all. If you're in, for example, in the airline manufacturing or something, aerospace manufacturing, it will change. So I think context is always key. And talking of context, and Carlos mentioned COVID, and one of the things that I've seen is in terms of transformation in the industry, is COVID has had an impact and towards attribution. And a great example of it is car brands. So car brands have traditionally sold cars by getting people into forecourts to go and test drive a car. During COVID, that wasn't possible. So what we saw is car brands looking at the way they do PR and saying, okay, if we can get the right content to the right audience, can we demonstrate that is transferring into something like hand raisers, where people say, I'm interested when the car is launched, to engage with that model? Or has PR driven people to search for that car model more? Obviously, there's challenges with disaggregating that from other marketing channels, but that kind of focus on digital, because we couldn't be present in COVID, I think has had an impact on both the metrics and the way people are approaching it as well. Again, context is key, industry to industry.
I think I love that, because I think you said multiple times, it's where the audience is. And I think that's one thing, I mentioned earlier, audience centric. If you need to make sure you're thinking about all the audiences that are important to your business. And when you do, you uncover certain audiences are going to over-index on different platforms, and you have to be able to find them. Like, we have some that are more academia or professional focused, and they have very specific platforms that aren't the public social ones we see, but they very much treat them as a social forum, social interactions, and being able to, whether you can get access to that or at least find some way that you can qualitatively track it, I think is crucial. And it also helps with that user journey. So, Carlos mentioned planning. If we don't put the audience at the center for the planning, you're going to not know about half these channels. You're not going to know about where to reach them. Like in the car industry, a couple of years ago, people on average went to 4 to 5 dealerships. Now they go to 1, and because they've done all their research online. And so if you haven't figured out where they're doing their research, you're not a part of the consideration set to even get to the dealership, right? So I think I really love how Gareth kind of outlined it depends on where the audience is, and then using that information to think about the different ways digitally that you can reach some of these people.
Yeah, just an excellent point. And on sort of context, just the importance of context. For me personally, I found one of the really interesting things with working with other departments, with other areas, particularly that savvy with social media and with also the more traditional media, is understanding sort of the sentiment, for example, on Twitter. I think a lot of brands, they often overreact to certain customer responses on Twitter, and we even see that on the political level as well. They think that winning Twitter means that you win the election or you win the customers, but often it's not the case. There is a real distortion between social media still and the real world, if you want to call it that. I just thought, just off the back of that, if anyone has any comments around that, around how do you navigate being able to prove that when is the time to hit the button to respond, and when is the time to actually not, because it will only escalate the issue more.
Yeah, I'll say something real quick, and then Carlos, I'll go over to you too. I think there's a few things. Google index Twitter is one of the first things Google indexes. So yes, you do need to keep an eye on it because it might show up in Google search. However, it's not going to have a very high Google authority until it is from someone who has a high Google authority or a high engagement or high interaction, or people are responding to it. So a lot of times the context that Gareth was mentioning is, I might show, okay, you're freaking out about this, but look at the portion of it's this amount compared to this, or of your total engagement, look at this, or how does it compare to something else? So quickly putting it into a context box for people, it will help, but also reminding them, like, that's why, as some people say, Twitter may or may not be as important for certain areas. And it's true. It's not, as certain audiences aren't going there. Google still sees it. So you have to at least keep an eye of, if it's getting a lot of momentum, how can you keep an eye on it? But I think the context box is critical for that. It helps keep everyone calm when they see it in comparison. And Carlos, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, well, I frowned because I was gonna say I'm gonna say something really short, and then I'll pass it to you, Nicole, because you're the expert in the subject, and I'm not. So yeah, you won. But what I would say is first, right before, I really dislike when people try to pass off Twitter or actually any social media measurement as if it was a magical predictor of what people think. Because it's not. And even if it were, we would need some research to prove it. And people tend to just say, well, 60% of people in Twitter are, they're liking me, or they have nice feelings towards me, or everyone that speaks to me. And that's very cool. And it can be a part of a PR strategy. It can be a very important part because Twitter does have an impact on people. There are outtakes and even outcomes that can be derived from acting in Twitter, of course. But it's not some magical number that, it's not a magical survey you're doing just by looking at Twitter numbers. And sometimes, Michael, to the first thing you said, politicians are very keen to it, but many times brands too, they just imagine that, because people are following them on Twitter and following brand A more than brand B, that's something good. And, that's just a number, and it can be a part of a strategy. And if it is part of a plan and a strategy, it can be an objective and it can be good, but it doesn't, just the number in and of itself is not good. It's just a number. And that's very clear when you see politicians and their campaigns. Many times, they're followed by millions of people, and they got a lot of followers who are very positive towards them. I weekly look at how the government looks here, and many times the president, who has literally the lowest public image in the history of Argentine presidents, literally the lowest right now, sometimes, he has kind of good sentiment. Sometimes he's in the green. That means nothing. First, it's a very small sampling. Second, it's very biased. And sentiment doesn't mean, having a positive sentiment when talking about someone does not necessarily correlate with thinking that someone is a good president. And so the first thing I would always say is, before trying to, edge social media into, this is the metric, just either introduce social media as part of your planning and then really say, well, how is having this number of followers gonna be transformed into changing or having this outcome with my stakeholders? How is this augmenting my positive tweets change the way people think about my brand? How, in Nicole's example, which I loved, I'm going to steal it, Nicole, by the way, for sure, how increasing the amount of tweets that people positively say about my car, the car I'm making, is going to make them choose to go to my dealership more. And the second part, I would say, is after you've done all that, if you really want to, if you imagine this works, well, you got to test it. Now, this in our industry is hard. First, because in the past 40 years, budgets as a proportion of the total marketing and PR budgets or comms budget, PR budgets have decreased. This is true. All of the science is out there. But, and it's in part it's our fault for not helping them prove, that they deserve more budget. But they still, if a PR professional can, and he says, in my plan, I have this hypothesis, and, if I increase this will happen. Well, test it and try to truly demonstrate attribution. Otherwise, we're just four white people speaking in a room, and we're all congratulating each other for doing something that no one can prove was right.
I think Carlos makes a really important point there. I think as a measurement professional, as a comms measurement professional, it's very easy to think of what we do as a process and as a very linear process. So you have your audiences, you have your objectives, you set out to monitor, measure, and you ask the question, did we achieve X or Y? But a really important question to ask as a PR professional of your client, as a measurement professional of PR professionals is, what kind of preconceptions are there about what PR is achieving or not achieving? We've just talked about which assets and social might or might not be important. What preconceptions does the business have about what the media landscape is and what is important? And as Carlos says, test those things as part of the research. Don't take them for granted and bias your research by just forming that linear process, but form hypotheses, test and check and question, and you get a lot more out of the data and you get usable insights. It's no use planning a whole campaign about that centers around Twitter if you haven't done the research to say, is Twitter important for this audience in this sector for this particular topic?
Absolutely, excellent point, Gareth. I thought, because time is already escaping us, so perhaps I'll just leave with one more sort of question, looking at sort of the future. And I wondered if the future of a lot of in-house and also on the agency side is actually having permanent staff who are working around data analysts. Is that what agencies are going to be doing down the track, is to ensure they have that embedded in their staff makeup? Where do you think that future is?
Yeah, I'll start there. I think agencies are already doing it for the most part. It might be a small team compared to a bigger, or they, might be highly reliant on some technology partners to, support them and back them up. But I think almost all agencies that I know of either have a team already or are looking to build out their teams. I think in-house is where we've been seeing most of the shift. I think in the past they had business analysts, or they might have had marketing analysts. I don't think we've always seen that either reaching over the silo to offer their help to communications, or them hiring their own. And I know quite a few of my clients who are looking to build out their teams. There have been a few of our clients who've been front runners and started this a couple years ago, but it was very hard for them to get up and running. Now they're noting it's much easier for them to get the support from the company and the buy-in to build out that. So I think agencies have already had that. I think we're going to see more in-house hire as well in the communications area, not just business or marketing.
I agree. I'm definitely seeing it within the agency landscape. I'm seeing it within major corporations. I think as access to content has become and data has become more democratized, what we now see is kind of that level of skill being applied to it and becoming a profession in and of itself. But I also see that, like with bringing marketing in-house or comms in-house, it works for some organizations and it doesn't work for others. So maybe going out of house for sector specialists, for example, or for a different media landscape is still going to be necessary. So yes, I'm seeing it in some situations. In others, it's just not really applicable.
Any final thoughts on that, Carlos?
No, I agree with Nicole and Gareth. In some situations it happens, in some it's not. I would think that there is a bright future ahead of us, and I see more and more. I see it in the agencies. They're much more, as Nicole said, they're trying to integrate much more, and they try to use that trove of data like never before. Sometimes I feel they don't know how to do it, and they don't know that we could help them do it better. I really feel that. Sometimes I hear them speak and they're oblivious to the fact that actually there is an industry around this. Not you, Nicole, because you're a queen in the industry, but I do hear it around the region, especially with smaller agencies. They're mesmerized by the fact, this thing you're talking about. What do you mean? You can get all of, not even the measurement industry. Sometimes I swear there are people who are mesmerized by the fact there is a monitoring industry. They're like, you mean you can get me all of the newspapers, digitally. I hear this all the time. It's amazing. So I think there's a lot of growth for us around, letting everyone know what we do and how we do it, so that they can start doing it better, and we can actually help people, be like Nicole and the massive team she has doing all of this, because that's the real story. Most small agencies around my region, and sometimes even in the US, much less than before, but you see it, they're oblivious to the fact that all of these things exist, that they can actually derive attribution, and it can be scientific, and they can sit with a CEO and prove it, and not have to show a lot of charts that are magic and that just are clouds. No, they can go and show them a value that and a return on their investment, and those numbers that boards really like to look at, and they have a methodology behind it that the board, if a board member asks, well, but how do you get this number? Well, of course, scientifically proven, my friend, and you can show it to them and they're going to be satisfied. And I think we have to help them more, but I do see that there's a very bright future, and I see it advancing very fast.
And I think off that note, if anyone else has any final thoughts or a call to action, really going forward, and because I do think, from my point of view, that the conversation around measurement and evaluation is always increasing all the time, and so I think it's encouraging to see that it's very much not just in the UK and in the US, but we're also seeing a lot of movement across Latin America and in Europe as well.
I think the only thing I would say is the people who are in this industry, so CARMA, especially with Gareth, you have Carlos, his organization, and everything. We're all AMEC members. If you want to talk to any of this, as you probably can tell, we'll talk for hours. So there is something to that. AMEC is creating a mentoring program around this. We have a lot of free content that can at least get you. There's a lot of classes. So I'd say just reach out, because everyone who's in this group, we love talking about it. And if we don't know the answer, there's people within our chapters or anything that we can definitely help point people to.
Agreed completely. We love talking, period, but also we love talking about it. So I would say 100%. If you want to talk about it, just if you have questions about what we just talked about, we're super open. We can talk about it in Spanish, in Portuguese, in French, in English, in German. We can. So we're really open. I'm really open to talk about it whenever there's an opportunity. And I think that Gareth, Nicole, me, you, Michael, we're here to really drive this forward, and we all have this responsibility that we carry with us. So we want to talk about it, and we're open. So if you need a call to action, we're open. Just send us an email, send us a tweet, send us whatever you want, except letters, because we hate them. But anything else, non-paper, send it, and we will reply.
It is emphatic. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Just let you know too that the session will be up on our YouTube channel in the next sort of week or two. So I will send that link around to anyone who's missed the session as well. And we're hoping that to have that recording in Spanish subtitles as well. So stay tuned for more events, and I thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.